obviously, we're talking about election reforms that will increase voter participation and accessibility, promote election security and accountability, and improve the way our elections are run. You've heard, of course, some of the progress and the things that FOS has supported in the past year. Our panelists, I know, will continue to speak about those things, but we have the great opportunity to look to the future, to talk about what kinds of potential we have for election reform, how those things should be prioritized in the coming year. And so I would like to move on to our first speaker, who is Gail Pellerin. She is the Registrar of Voters for Santa Cruz County and has been working for some 27 years in public service, 7 years for the state legislature, and 20 years serving as the primary elections official in her county. She is the immediate past president of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials, and I am told not CASEO, but rather CACEO. And so therefore she is steeped in much of the difficulty and the challenge and the wonderful opportunities that the elections officials have had over these years. I'd like Gail to talk to us something about what she sees for the future, as well as what has been going on in your circles. And I have to ask all of you to deal with, bear with us as we switch from one PowerPoint to another. There you go.
Okay, well, welcome. Yeah, I was thinking that FOS also, we need an R there so we could be called FORCE. So I thought future of our California election. So maybe we could work with Doug on getting that R in there. But yes, CACEO is the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials, and some of our priorities for 2013, unfunded state mandates again. Man, I read this morning about the state having $4 billion. Darren, could we have a chunk of that to help restore some of these state mandates? That would be great. But, you know, we have a huge amount of money that goes into conducting elections, and nothing comes back to us from the state to help fund that. And the state mandates that we've had as far as permanent vote by mail and vote by mail tabulation by precinct, 15-day close of registration, voter registration procedures, and I understand 4 more have been added, are no longer going to be funded by the state. So counties are having to bear the burden of those costs, which means other county vital programs are no longer, are going to be cut as a result. Online voter registration, yeah, huge success, but still need for improvements. Accessibility, we talked about that earlier. We have issues with the multiple record submissions, address standardization, and everybody talked about the signature issues. We had the same issues in our county as well. Top 2 primary, we have some changes there moving forward. Right now, there's a lot of language that has to appear on the top of the ballot. We'd like to move that off the ballot and into the sample ballot. And then we need to deal with some of these write-in issues as far as establishing a threshold so somebody doesn't just get 1 vote and end up on a top 2 ballot in the general. Lots in the way of petition reforms. I mean, Deborah Seiler's here today, who's our queen of petition check verification guidelines, and has introduced a number of proposals to help make petition checking, more efficient, and so changing a trigger for the 100% count from 95 to 105. Currently, it's 110%. That would really help save a lot of taxpayer dollars. And also to have sort of these rolling checks that if it is a 100% check and once they reach the threshold of qualification, we don't have to keep going and having these counties keep checking to get to their 100% that a petition could qualify once it meets that threshold. So those are just some of the CACEO priorities. I'm sure we have lots of registrars here. You guys could chime in with others. Another big hit, the new year brought us new languages. So 30 counties now will have new language requirements for posting sample ballots at the polls. This is huge. A lot of counties miss this. They're learning about it, as we speak. I know for Santa Cruz County, we don't have any voting rights languages, but we do have languages that we do provide sample ballot and election materials, and we do Spanish, but we were added Chinese and Tagalog. So, these aren't finalized yet, but we're going to be getting those precincts where there's 3% of the folks who require some language assistance, and we'll be putting together a program to meet that requirement. But I believe now there's only one of the 58 counties that is an English-only county. All the rest of us now have multiple languages. New use procedures. This is another huge area where Santa Cruz County, Jamie Young, Tricia Weber, who are here, are working with Tim McNamara of LA and others. But CACEO and the Secretary of State are working together with voting system vendors to update the voting system use procedures for all voting systems in all counties. This is really a huge ordeal where these procedures outline how we maintain, test, audit, and secure voting systems. And they're, 400-plus page documents that need revision to be updated to basically reflect what currently is being done and what can be done. So that's a huge goal for us this year. Uniformity is always something we strive for, and we do a lot of that. I said Deborah Seiler just completed her petition signature verification guidelines. I believe they're at the Secretary of State now for their review. UOCAVA is going to go under a revision this year. That's the Overseas Voter Act. County access plans, another huge area where Santa Cruz County has a lot of experience in the area of accessibility, thanks to Jamie Young, who I think is a leader in the state on this issue. But working with counties on having a uniform access plan, getting those VACs going, voting accessibility advisory committees, is also essential. The vote count standards, the Secretary of State redid in 2012 because of the laws that changed regarding marks on ballots, and those are something that counties need to continue to follow. I suspect we'll be looking at something in the way of vote by mail guidelines. We currently have count, no count, but I see an expansion of those in the future. Tim and his committee are working, is Tim here? I don't think I saw him. But they're working on the language glossaries, and with all these new languages, having uniformity there is going to be really important. And we have some Canvas procedures that CACEO did a number of years ago that probably are due for some updating as well. But as much as we try to be uniform, we also need to bear in mind that we are unique. So I picked Alpine County versus Los Angeles County. And Alpine, you see, has a lovely 773 registered voters. Los Angeles has a lot more than that. The languages in Alpine are English only. Los Angeles, I can't even, you had English plus 11. I think you do 4 more because your cities require different languages in different cities. Voting precincts, Alpine had 5. They were all mail ballot. They don't have any polling places. You can see Los Angeles has quite a few, which is probably an organizational nightmare getting those set up and staffed. And the staffing, there's 4 poll workers in Alpine. We've got 21,540 in Los Angeles, 9,770 bilingual. The turnout, huge numbers, and the one I love the most is certifying the election, is that Alpine did it in 3 days. God bless them. And Los Angeles County did 26 days straight, working Thanksgiving too. You guys are amazing. But I think that we need to bear that in mind as we're moving forward and developing laws, that we take into account that we are very different in our sizes and needs. So that's all I have. What do I do now?
Gail asks, what do I do now? And I'll show you the screen. Let's see, I believe this is, good. Our next speaker is not the person in your program. Arturo Vargas, the executive director of NALEO and the NALEO Educational Fund, is ill. I think he may represent a number of people who would have liked to be here but are down with the flu. But in very capable hands, instead, Rosalind Gold is going to speak. She's the senior director of policy, research, and advocacy for NALEO, which, as I think almost all of you must know, is the national, well, now I don't have it written down. I have heard Rosalind National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials and the NALEO Educational Fund. She is the director for the Educational Fund. NALEO has programs to integrate Latinos into the American political society, provide professional development opportunities and technical assistance to the more than 6,000 in the nation, Latino elected and appointed officials, and they monitor and conduct advocacy on issues important to the Latino community. I've seen Rosalind at work for years. She's got over 2 decades of experience coordinating research, but also having experience in policy in areas like newcomer civic integration, election returns, voting rights, redistricting, and the census. I'll ask Rosalind to come up to the microphone to give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trudy, and thank you all again for joining us. Arturo very much sends his regrets that he could not join you this morning. He really does have a bad bug, and he felt that it would not be a good idea to start off our advocacy and collaborative work by infecting the entire group of the best and brightest minds on election reform with what he has. So that's why he's not with us here today. Thank you. So before I go into detail in my presentation, what I'd like to start our discussion with is I want to take you on a little journey with me into Governor Jerry Brown's FY 2013-24 budget. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a little walk into the appendices to that budget, where buried deep inside all sorts of numbers, we found a fascinating piece of data. The California Department of Finance projects in a few months, in July 2013, California's population will be 39% white and 39% Latino. So as of July 2013, there will no longer be a racial or ethnic group that has a plurality of the state's population. Latinos and whites will be at parity. And the projection also says that come the end of fiscal year 2013, Latinos will be the largest population group in this state. So as we talk and think about election reform, we cannot even start to discuss these issues without thinking about what is going to be the impact on Latino voters. If we're truly going to have a democracy that's inclusive, that's responsive to all of the voters in the state and all of the voices in the state, if we're going to have a democracy that is accountable, we have to take into account the implications of any proposal, anything that you hear somebody propose today, what is going to be the impact on Latino participation. And to move us there, I want to just quickly talk about what do we know about Latino participation in California. So if you can take a look at the chart there, this tells you what went on in presidential elections. You see a very nice progression of actual voters. From 2008, we had about 3 million Latinos turning out. We project that in 2012, it increased by 1 million to close to 4 million. We don't have actual numbers for 2012. When we get them, we'll see if our projections turned out, but you see this really good news, a nice steady progression of Latino participation. You see the kind of same trend with the number of Latinos registered to vote in presidential elections. You see how those two lines are going together very nicely. Well, guess what happens when you look at the number of Latinos who are eligible to vote? What I'm talking about are U.S. citizen, voting age citizens. Look at the gap. The number of eligible Latinos is growing much faster than those who are registered and those who actually voted. So that gap is what our election reform policies must address, in part. Because if, again, we're going to really have the entire eligible Latino electorate engaged and voting, we need to close that registration gap. And as you'll see in off-year elections, we're going to have a little bit of a turnout gap. So this is in presidential midterm elections. Again, you see the same good news, nice steady progression. If anybody wants to know why was there a dip in 2002, come talk to me. Apparently both Latinos and Californians were kind of bored by that election. Going to the registration, you have a bit more of a gap between those who are registered in off-year elections and those who turned out. But again, you see this really large gap between those who are eligible, those who are registered, and those who actually turned out. So when, again, we talk about what is the implications, what are the implications of election reform policies for Latinos, think about that gap as a good starting point. How do we close it? As we look forward to FY 2013, there's a couple of areas we're going to be really focusing on, and it's going to allow us to build on our 2012 work, which was a wonderful collaboration. You know, thank you so much to all of our partners in the Future of California elections, which we call FOSE. As well as the Irvine Foundation for its enormous leadership in starting the project and leading the dialogue. First of all, you see that big gap between who's eligible and who's registered. So how do we make registration more accessible, more inclusive for Latinos? Well, we started our work with making sure that as online voter registration was implemented last year, we took into account the needs of Latino voters, and we did that in a couple of ways. First of all, we've seen data that shows how do people access the internet and web, and that Latinos are somewhat different than whites in terms of how they access the internet. They don't use computers as much as they use smartphones or other mobile devices. So we were very appreciative that the Secretary of State was very responsive in making sure that the online voter registration platform was not just one that you got from a standing computer, but that you could eventually get from a smartphone or get from other platforms. And we also appreciate the work of local election officials, county election officials, for the help they did in making their systems responsive as well. We also promoted online voter registration with community colleges, which, as much as we have Latino students at UCs or California State Universities, we have a disproportionately large number of Latinos at community colleges, and we anticipate we'll continue that work in 2013 in the future. Looking forward, you've heard a lot of talk about voter registration modernization. Again, we really want to think about what does that mean for Latinos. Does that mean, for example, because Latinos are so mobile, we're going to make sure we try to use existing data sources to import change of address information directly into the voter rolls for the post office? That's certainly something we can do some thinking about. And we're also going to be looking at other kinds of, again, how do changes in voting technology or voter registration procedures affect Latinos and provide them with more opportunities. The second large constellation of topics we've been hearing about is civics education and how do we especially reach out to youth. We are going to be trying to see about whether it's looking at the high school civics curriculum, looking at other ways to reach youth, to make sure that they keep getting the message about the importance, not only the importance of engagement, but also all of that. Again, you heard about how the need for specific information. We have a hotline where Latino voters can call and other voters can call. It's bilingual in English and Spanish. And most of the questions are about things like, what time do the polls open? Where do I get my ballots? What do I do if, I'm not on the registration roll? So figuring out how to get that basic information to youth and whether the high school civics curriculum is the way to do it is something we want to look at. That's a high priority. We're also very interested in the things that we're hearing about the possibility of pre-registering youth. In the abstract, we think it's a great idea, but again, looking specifically at how this might affect Latinos, we want to do some more thinking about through the details. Let me just give you a very specific example. So if pre-registration is implemented where you have a high school classroom and a teacher just hands out a bunch of voter registration forms to everybody in that classroom, there's going to be a lot of those students who are not going to be eligible to vote at that time, not just because of age, but because of immigration or citizenship status. The last thing we want to do is to have those students fill out pre-registration forms. And we're concerned that a procedure that makes those students stigmatized or, they feel like, oh, I just have to fill it out, everybody else is doing it. We don't think that's an optimal way for implementation. So we really want to drill down and think about how would pre-registration be best implemented in the Latino community. The final issue that we've heard a bit about, thank you so much, Gail, for bringing it up, which is language access for Latinos. Many Latinos are not yet fully proficient in English. They are a significant segment of our electorate and of our citizen population. We had a chance to work closely with the Secretary of State's office to make the voter guide more accessible to those Latinos, and we're going to continue that work through some community forums that you've heard about that we're going to be doing come 2013. But we also think that a lot of counties are doing language access really well right now, and we know that county officials talk to each other, but we want to see if we can even get you talking to each other a little more. We're going to be putting together a handbook, and we're going to be highlighting best practices in language accessibility so that we can have you all share all the good work you're doing on language accessibility and continue the progress we've made. That's our priorities. I'll be happy to answer questions or talk more, but I just want to come back to my beginning point, which is, as Latino participation, engagement, voting, and registration goes, so goes the entire state of California. And we cannot do election reform, we can't make our democracy more responsive unless all of our voices are heard, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to continue working with all of you to make that a reality. Thank you.
I'm going to go back to that, and it just looks so good to let that stay on the screen while we're waiting for the next PowerPoint, which won't be for a couple of minutes. I want to thank Rosalind for bringing up the idea that diversity in California, which is so great, does mean that reforms in California will affect different communities differently. And as we look toward reform, one of the themes you're hearing is we've got to think about all the impacts on all the different communities in our great state. And one of those communities, of course, is the community of people with some kind of disability. Hillary Sklar is our next speaker, and one of her themes in our discussing before the panel what we would be expecting to hear today was that as we increase accessibility for disabled people, we want it to be in a way that is not separate but equal. And that is a challenge, of course. You had on your tables as you sat down a statement from Hillary, and just to say something about the Disability Rights California organization, right at the very beginning it mentions that they are an independent, nonprofit, statewide organization. They are charged with ensuring the full participation in the electoral process for individuals with disabilities. And Hillary is an attorney with the organization. You've heard mention of the VACS, the VAACS, Voter Accessibility Advisory Committees. She is a member and the community chair for Los Angeles County and is also a member of the Orange County and San Diego VACS. Hillary, I will let you take over, and please just use the microphone there. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, very well. Mr. Microphone. Okay. Thank you and welcome for being here. I'm just in the short time we've been together, very excited and very encouraged by the plurality of voices and the common ground I've heard thus far already. And I think that the composition of the audience really mirrors the composition of the FOSE committee. So it's been lovely so far, and thank you to James Irvine and Common Cause. Before I launch into a discussion about reform, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. What do we mean when we talk about people with disabilities? People with disabilities are not a monolithic group. My guess is we each know somebody who has some type of disability, and my guess is many of us have assumptions about people with different types of disabilities. Maybe some things are a little erroneous, maybe there's some fear, and we know that there's stigma around different types of disabilities. So what do we mean when we talk about disabilities? We mean someone may have one type of disability, they might have multiple types of disabilities, they may have been born with disability, they may acquire a disability. We are talking about people with physical and orthopedic disabilities, manual dexterity disabilities, which is particularly important when we talk about filling out things on paper or electronic voting systems. We're talking about people with developmental disabilities and cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury, psychiatric disabilities, blindness, other types of vision impairments, neurological disabilities such as stroke or multiple sclerosis, and sensory disabilities, which includes blindness, maybe deaf, hard of hearing as well. And again, to bring the point home, someone may have more than one type. So someone might have cerebral palsy, which is considered a developmental disability, and with the cerebral palsy may also use a wheelchair, and may also have a learning disability, and may also have some limited range of motion with their arms, their shoulders, their hands. Things that if we don't have any of those things, we don't think about. And this comes into play directly when we talk about how do elections work, access to information about elections, accessing the ballot, accessing voter registration materials. And what we know as an organization and from our partnership with other disability rights organizations is that people with disabilities want to vote. If there is nothing else that I have heard in 10 years in the community is that people with disabilities want to vote and want to be engaged civically. Many do vote, and many have had very frustrating experiences. Some of the most sophisticated advocates that I know have walked away from voting because of repeated frustrating experiences trying to vote in private, with a secret ballot, independently. And we know that along the way in the process of voting, that's the what does it mean to vote? When is the election? How do I register? What do I need to know? How do we get to the poll site, et cetera? At any one point in that process, there can be a barrier and has been a barrier. And so one goal of reform must be identifying those barriers, understanding those barriers, not just the fact of the barrier, but how does it work? What does that mean to the person with a disability? How does their disability interact and make it possible for there to be a barrier when it seems like it shouldn't be a barrier, instead of running from it or being afraid or not knowing what questions to ask? And we know that at any point people do stop and give up. And that is counter to why we are all here. I think as an underlying notion is the reminder that exercising the right to vote is one of the most, if not the most fundamental rights we have. And embedded in that is the right for that to be a secret process. That's what makes us unique. And so I think that that is a thread that could guide us as we talk about reform. Anytime we develop a system or a process, we must ask ourselves, will it be secret for all? Will it be independent for all? And to carry on with a very prominent theme of the remarks so far today, this must be done in collaboration. People with disabilities cannot do it alone. We must, as a community, work together across disabilities, but we also must work with people who do not represent the interests of people with disabilities directly in their work. And we must work together with election officials and state agencies, and you must work with us. It's a two-way street. And we are a rich resource of expertise, and not any one of us knows it all. So I encourage the exploration and continued meaningful collaboration that already exists. And I point to the VACs as one rich source. Strong in some counties, underutilized in other counties. And this notion of separate but equal resonates with people with disabilities, because for far too long people with disabilities have been invisible and yet very visible. Visible in ways that we just don't understand what we're seeing, but invisible because integration into the community is not always possible, and voting is a heck of a way to becoming integrated into the community, and ongoing civic participation as well. And so separate but equal sometimes actually looks like separate but not quite even equal. And so, what can we do? Any attempt at reform, specific to people with disabilities or applicable to all, must not only include tapping into the rich resources in the community, but it must happen in real time as bills are being drafted. And yes, some of us have been brought to the table, and some of us have insisted that we've been brought to the table. But it must happen in real time before the change actually happens, instead of after the fact, once a bill has been adopted and implemented. Yes, nothing is perfect. Yes, there will always be a fix. But traditionally, for people with disabilities, we have been an afterthought. And for reform to be meaningful, that needs to stop. The goal should be not just increasing, well, first it's increasing participation, but then maximizing participation by people with disabilities. And we know that, we've heard about tablets and iPads, et cetera. We know that one thing that might work for one community will likely work for another. And so that's part of why it's important to talk to each other so that we save money, we preserve and conserve our resources, but we find out that one thing might work for more than we know. Specific recommendations that I have are in the papers that were on your seats, and I thank Common Cause and Doug Chapin very much for their assistance in making it possible to make those available to you. If nothing else, I think we need to start talking to each other more, and that goes both ways. And the roots are always understanding one another and what that means, and maybe not being as afraid of one another. So thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. I think our next speaker is likely to comment on some ways in which what she works on most directly benefits from the kinds of principles that Hillary has commented on in the disability community. There's also, of course, the language access community and modernization of the voting systems in general. Lori is the civic engagement attorney with the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties. She brought to California a lot of background work with nonprofits, community organizing, election protection, and has already done quite a few things in a very short time since about 2011 in San Diego County. Lori?
Thank you. I also want to thank Common Cause for bringing together so many wonderful people today, and especially the James Irvine Foundation for the opportunity to participate in the future of California elections, and to echo what the earlier panels discussed, which is the benefits of this incredible collaboration and all of the positive things that were accomplished last year. I'd like to kind of continue on the theme that Hillary discussed, and really talk about it, and maybe it's because we're both lawyers. She's talking about the right to vote as the most fundamental right, and I want to talk about the issues that we're discussing in the framework of what I think is the disenfranchisement issue in California. It's easy for us in California to kind of look at other states that are battling voter ID laws, that are battling restrictions on groups that register voters, and think, we've got it pretty good here, right? We're not filing lawsuits left and right, and we're not battling it out in court right before an election or on election day. But we do have a serious disenfranchisement problem in California. There are 5.5 million eligible voters who are not registered to vote. And what I'd like to discuss is the ways in which we might address that problem, and to sort of expand a little bit on some of the things that people have discussed today. One of those is civic education, and I'm not going to go into that because that was already addressed on the earlier panel, and I think Kim is going to discuss that more in depth. I'd like to talk about modernization of voter registration and the ways in which we register voters, and the ways in which voter registration is not accessible to the people that Hillary is discussing, and to our language communities, to people who are lower income. And those are the people who make up a lot of that 5.5 million people. And it results in those who are registered, as Rosalind was pointing out, are are not representative of the rich diversity. Our participation numbers are reflecting that more and more, but the franchise is not reflective of who we are as a state. And so how do we move forward with that? And there are a couple of things the couple of ways to look at this, I think. The first is we have a lot of existing laws on the books that need to be implemented in better ways. And a couple of those were recently passed, online voter registration and same-day registration. And we need to think seriously about the ways in which we move those forward. And then we also need to talk about some of the newer, sexier reforms and new laws that we'd like to see. And the one I'd like to discuss a little bit is automated registration and the ways in which we can make it easier for people to register vote when they're already interacting with state agencies, as most of us do. So, for example, and there are organizations that are really leading the way on this. The Pew Center on the States, which has done a lot of research and work around voter registration modernization, and David Becker, I know, is here today and will hopefully contribute later. And the Brennan Center for Justice in New York also doing a lot of work around this issue, and the ways in which we can make it easier for someone who's already at DMV, who's already entering all of their information, right, provide all that information, and when asked if they want to register to vote, is handed a paper registration form. So they have to re-enter everything that they just filled out, and then that paper registration form is left at DMV and may or may not be sent to a registrar of voters office in the county that it's supposed to go to. So automating registration would mean instead of completing another form, someone would simply answer a few more questions, and that information could be sent electronically to our new statewide database when that comes out, or through the online voter registration system. So we're really at a moment in California where we have several things converging. VoteCal is about to be developed. A contract was awarded, and we're going to be developing a statewide voter database. We have online voter registration that's already interacting with DMV and soon other state agencies. And to think about the ways in which those things, as they're being developed and improved upon, intersect with each other. And I think that's something that the future of California elections will be looking at, and it's something that requires incredible input from stakeholders, and for us to be thinking about how it can accommodate the changes that we think are coming in the future as we move towards paperless registration, as we move towards a notion of portable registration where we're not continually re-registering to vote, but your voter registration stays with you. And as we tackle some of those issues, I think those will be priorities, some of which need legislative solutions and some of which need a lot of involvement to make sure that those things are moving forward in the way they should. One of the things that I'd like to point out again, and I don't think it can be emphasized enough, is the ways in which marginalized communities are excluded from these discussions and from implementation over and over again. And we celebrate online voter registration as for the success that it had, but I think it's also important for us to learn to not ignore the failures that lie therein. And I think as a state, we should be ashamed that we have an online voter registration system that's not accessible to everyone. It's not accessible to the more than 1 million limited English proficient voters who speak an Asian language. It's not accessible to people with disabilities who need assistance in filling out the form. There's no provision in online voter registration to indicate that you need that assistance or have been assisted in filling it out. There were problems with the CAPTCHA for people who are visually impaired. That we need to, going forward in this century, not launching technology or reforms that exclude significant groups of people. And it's important for us to be mindful of that going forward. And Hillary did a great job of, I think, helping us really understand the perspective of a person with disabilities or multiple disabilities, and to really, I think we have to grapple with what are the stigmas and the assumptions that go along with that. And I think the same goes for people who are in those other marginalized communities. For example, those who are low income. You know, there are assumptions that, well, maybe that person isn't, you know, as concerned about voting when they are worried about getting their food stamp application in, or they're applying for public assistance, and the last thing on their mind is registering to vote. We have laws on the books that require that they be offered the opportunity to register, but those laws have not actually been enforced in California. And as Jenny Breschneider pointed out from the Secretary of State's office, we've been collaborating with them to re-implement the National Voter Registration Act and to provide voter registration opportunities for people applying for public assistance, and to just give you an example of the ways in which that can have an impact. I want to just share a couple of statistics before I pass it over to Kim. In San Diego County, we began re-implementation efforts last year with the leadership of our now former Registrar of Voters, Deborah Seiler, and some of the advocacy work that we were doing at the ACLU, and that was with the support of the Irvine Foundation as well. And with just a few steps at re-implementing this bill and making sure that people were being offered the opportunity to register to vote when they went to a public assistance office, San Diego County's numbers skyrocketed, demonstrating that when someone is offered the opportunity to register to vote, they're very often going to take you up on it. So in San Diego County, the most recent numbers show that in the last 3 months, more than 3 times as many people registered to vote as registered in 2009, 2010, and 2011 combined. So this is with just a few steps to make sure that it's easier, right, that people know about the opportunity to register to vote, that this is the impact that it can have on those communities that are continually slipping through the cracks. So there'll be more work on implementing those laws in the future, but that's it.
I didn't mean to take you off
No, that's
mid-sentence, but thank you so much, Hillary. And I'm sure we'll have questions that have to do with all of the two you've talked about. Our final speaker has been mentioned now a couple of times. Kim Alexander is the president and founder of the California Voter Foundation. I remember Kim probably 20 years ago in her role as a person working for California Common Cause, and she struck out. In some ways, when we talk technology, she was one of the first people who realized that California needed to think about data and technology and how it was transforming our election processes. In the interest of time, I'm going to just bring you over to talk from your PowerPoint. And let's see, I believe that it's going to be this one. Does it look familiar?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Trudy. Oh. Sorry. Thanks, Kate. Is that sort of like that? Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. It is great to see all of you here, see so many familiar faces. I want all of you to meet each other today, so. And thank you so much to Common Cause and Irvine for bringing this together. First slide I've got up echoes something that Lori said. We have one of the lowest rates of registration and participation in the country, despite the fact that we have none of the barriers that we see in other states in terms of making registration difficult, making vote by mail difficult, making voter ID requirements burdensome for people. We don't have any of that, and yet we still rank among the bottom, 45th place, tied with Tennessee, and only above Hawaii, Oklahoma, Indiana, Texas, and West Virginia in terms of our voter turnout. So that is really appalling when you think about it. The highest level of turnout in the last election, according to data compiled at George Mason University, was 76% in Minnesota and 73% in Wisconsin. Now, I know we're not Minnesota or Wisconsin, but I'm sure that we could do better. So what is it going to take to move California from 55% to 75% turnout? We could get there. That would be moving from 13 million people voting in a presidential election in California to 18 million people voting in a presidential election. Can we imagine that we could get there? I think we could. Other states can do it. Why not us? So I'm going to talk about a few ideas, recommendations the California Voter Foundation is pursuing to get us to a higher level of participation. Number one is improving proposition donor disclosure. Darren Chesson spoke about this earlier. This is a great shortcut for voters, and we know a lot of people in this state are intimidated by the length and complexity of our ballots. We have the chair of the FPPC here, Ann Ravel. If you could just raise your hand if you're still in the room. I don't know if she's still here. but she is leading some great, here she is, way over here. Our chair of the FPPC is doing a phenomenal job leading an effort in California to expand disclosure. We need to get donors listed in the print and online ballot pamphlet. We need to put this information about who's funding propositions under voters' noses when they're making those decisions, which is when they crack open that ballot pamphlet. We can put it in print, and then we can update it online. It's really that simple. We have the data, we have the technology, we need legislation to make that happen. And I want to mention this is a reform that's also recommended in the PPIC report that just came out recently, Improving California's Democracy. If you've not read it, I encourage you to, and we're lucky to have the chair of PPIC, Gary Hart, here. If you can just give a little wave. Gary, thank you. Recommendation number 2 is to improve the vote-by-mail process so more ballots are successfully cast and counted. I met with Doug Chapin yesterday. I told him I was going to give him a stat that would blow his mind, and I think that it did, which is that the error rate for vote-by-mail ballots today in California is the same as the error rate for vote-o-matic machines that we had in 2000 that we decertified because of this error rate. So if you define error rate as people who show up to vote and think they cast a ballot and it doesn't get counted, we're back at 2%, folks, with vote-by-mail balloting. So we need to address this. We crunched some data the Secretary of State compiled, and we were able to come up with this statistic. Changing the law to allow ballots postmarked by Election Day would certainly be a significant increase in voter turnout in California. Might even improve turnout by 1 whole percentage point in a given election. And I want to say, you know, I think voters need to take responsibility, but I had the pleasure of visiting Jill Levine's elections office at the end of the election and looked at some of these late ballots that arrived. I saw one postmarked from Los Angeles, October 20th. I saw one that was express mail, $20 someone spent to send it from New York on November 1st. Still didn't arrive in time. So it's just heartbreaking when you see these piles, thousands of ballots, every election that are not getting counted. So we need to focus on that, and that's an issue that the California Voter Foundation hopes to be working on. Another area that we could make some improvements is to upgrade California's voting equipment and approval process. And today we are releasing a new policy brief that I have and Megumi has, and there's a picture of it up here, so please come see me if you'd like when we have plenty for everybody. It's looking at California's voting technology experience with modernization, looking back, looking ahead. We need to improve California's system of approving voting equipment to allow for more innovation while maintaining high levels of security and transparency and accountability. You heard Dean Logan earlier today speak about the Voting Systems Assessment Project. That project is discussed in detail in this policy brief, and he and his staff are doing a phenomenal job pioneering what will be the next generation of voting equipment in California, but they need support. They need help from the legislature, they need help from the Secretary of State. I've listed out here some of the daunting challenges that LA is facing. These are all in the policy brief. And these include restrictions on how they can use all those public funds that have been earmarked for their voting systems. There's currently a lack of detailed written guidelines for the state's voting system approval process. There's a state law that prohibits jurisdictions from entering into a contract for a voting system unless it's already received approval from the SOS. Federal certification is required, and those of you who are familiar with the Election Assistance Commission know that agency is troubled right now. And of course, the cost of this certification process will be borne by LA, which will not be marketing a commercial product, which most vendors are okay with bearing the cost of certification because they expect to recoup those costs through sales and service contracts. So LA is doing something very innovative, but they're trying to do it within a system that is very restrictive and then focused toward this old model that we need to move away from of having counties go out and buy commercial off-the-shelf voting systems and simply taking whatever is available to them rather than doing what LA did, which is first figure out what do our voters want, what's going to help these young people connect to the voting process, and then getting a system built to those specs. So this is very important what's happening in LA, and it's going to help everybody, not just LA. Every county needs to upgrade their voting systems. Every state in the country needs to upgrade their voting systems. So I really applaud what Dean and his staff are doing, and I hope that FOS and all of us will continue to help support that effort and help us move forward. Here are some of the policy questions to consider, particularly on voting technology modernization, and these, again, are outlined in the policy brief. how can we make a testing and certification system more accessible to not-for-profit voting systems? Right now, it's geared to commercial systems. Should we make changes to state law to allow Los Angeles to use its bond money to develop a new not-for-profit system? That's for the legislature to decide. Are there different approaches to certification and testing, such as states collaboratively testing equipment that would be more efficient and economical rather than having California go it alone? So these are some of the policy questions we will continue to discuss with folks. I hope to discuss with you later on today when we have a breakout group focusing on these issues. And my last recommendation I want to make before we open up to questions is that the state needs to provide ongoing funding to counties for elections. Elections are huge. You can all applaud county registrars and everybody else. Elections are a huge unfunded mandate by the federal and the state government on local government. And it's completely discretionary funding. All the money that's spent to pay for putting on elections, hiring poll workers, training poll workers, counting ballots, verifying the vote, all of that is borne by the counties. And it's really critical that the state pay some portion on an ongoing basis of these costs. And one proposal we want people to think about is maybe do a trade to give the counties money, and in exchange the counties will report to the state on their election performance. And in that way we can measure all the counties' performance and see who's up, who's down. And if you increase your registration, guess what? You get more money from the state. I mean, why can't we set up elections to operate at the same level of high expectations of performance that we put on every other sector of government and public life, on schools, on transportation, on public safety? We have measurements, we collect data. We don't just say, oh, there went another road, it didn't work out the way we want, but we'll build it better the next time. We fix the road. So we need to do that. We need to take elections as seriously as we take all these other areas of public policy. You know, Obama spoke of long lines on election night and again in his inauguration address on Monday, and we know there's an appetite for election reform right now. But how do we sustain that? This is always the challenge for election reform. How do we actually sustain the momentum? I think that the future of California elections is a great vehicle for sustaining it, and it's what gives me hope that we will finally achieve a higher level of performance, greater uniformity, and greater participation for our voters in our state. So thank you.
Thanks, Kim. We have time for about, I would say, four questions, more if everybody is very brief. And Megumi has the microphone, so please put up your hand or stand up and we'll ask her to take it to those of you who have a question for the group. First is men.
Thank you. Excellent panel. My name's Steve Cheston. I'm president of Californians for Electoral Reform and a member of the League of Women Voters. Hi, Trudy.
Hi.
You talked about the right to cast a vote, but I would like you to focus on the right to cast an effective vote. You also discussed turnout. What gets people engaged, what gets people excited about voting is the ability to elect someone who represents them. If you're a blue voter in a red district or a red voter in a blue district, you're not going to be that motivated to go out and vote. And if you're a blue voter in a blue district or a red voter in a red district, and something happens to interfere with your ability to get to the polls, your daughter got sick or something like that, you know your candidate's going to win, so it's okay if I don't vote. If you raise the issue of what Minnesota and Wisconsin do, I'd really like to know, what do they do that's different? I know you pointed out disclosure. Is that one of the things that they do in terms of propositions? Is that how they get their voter turnout? I know other countries, I'm leading to a question.
Oh, all right,
Yeah.
we need a question.
Other countries, we should also look at other countries. Countries that use a proportional representation voting system have much higher turnouts than we have in this country, because a voter in a proportional system has more opportunity to elect someone who represents them.
Can you tell me who on the panel you want to direct this question to?
Well,
We'll get
first
an
to
answer.
Kim in terms of what exactly is it that Minnesota and Wisconsin do,
Okay.
and also to the panel as a whole. I would really like to see FOSE look at proportional voting systems as a way of increasing civic engagement,
All right.
increasing voter participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie, did you indicate you wanted to answer?
I can respond to the election system.
Go right ahead.
Do you want me to? Because that question came up earlier too, and last year when FOS was meeting, we did actually have some discussion, and Robert Rubin, who used to be the director of the Voting Rights Project at Lawyers Committee, was a part of the group then, and myself were both raising those issues regarding the way in which we elect people and the way in which people cast their votes. Traditionally, our organizations have looked at-large election systems, shifting to district election systems, but and we did raise the issue of ranked choice voting, proportional voting, and the instant runoff voting to explore the ways in which those might empower voters, particularly in communities where you can't have a majority district when looking at it we weren't looking at it in terms of red and blue, we were looking at it in terms of voters of color, and the challenge as those communities become more integrated, but those votes are still polarized. That's something that the group last year felt needed more research. It's not an area where there is a lot of research. We initially explored reaching out to academics and others to help us kind of gather that information to make, so, that's something I think the group, it has been discussed. It just was not something that at that time felt like it could rise to the priority level in terms of something we could accomplish in that year. But I think that will continue to be something that's discussed, and we welcome the input of groups that are doing research on that so that we can explore that further.
Thanks, Lori. And as I think you all know, FOS is going to continue to look at all these different issues and the priorities that have been mentioned, the principles that have been mentioned, and look at what should be the game plan for the coming year. So that'll certainly be on the table. Megumi, you have your mic to give to someone else?
I'm sorry, could I just, Trudy, I
Oh.
promise it'll be really short. Okay. We already have the California Voting Rights Act on the book, which says under certain circumstances, you have to go from at-large to district elections. We need to enforce it, and if people want to talk more to me about how to enforce it and make it happen, I'll be happy to.
Thanks,
And I just-
thanks, Rosalind.
Just to go real quick, response to
Very
Steve's
quick, because
question
we do want
about
to try to have
yeah.
one or two other questions.
Minnesota and Wisconsin, they have same-day registration where people can actually register to vote at their polling place on election day. They also are more homogeneous populations and they move less. So, they've got those. But really, that same-day registration, I think, is the big difference.
Thank you. And another question?
My name is R. Daniel Hernandez. I'm with La Maestra Community Health Centers in San Diego. I wanted to ask any of the panelists what they think about allowing weekend voting and also encouraging community-based organizations to register people to vote. Our particular organization started as an amnesty program before it was a clinic, and previous federal administrations actually tried to discourage people from voting. They actually tried to discredit us, and because of that, the people on our board don't want to have anything to do with voter registration because they basically put a mole in our system, try to discredit us, say that we were trying to slant registration one way or another. So I want to ask, what do you think about the importance of getting community-based organizations to get active in the voter registration
Thank you.
process?
And I think Gail would
Yeah,
like
and
to respond.
definitely, I think most counties do offer a weekend voting program. We do in Santa Cruz County, and we work with a lot of groups, organizations to basically, we're a small staff, so anything we can do to help our numbers and getting out to various communities, we like to do. We just like to educate them as far as what we need on the card to make sure it's a good voter registration card. And when online voter registration came, we were out there with tablets and computers getting people registered as well, so we welcome it.
Thank you. Hillary, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm all for early voting. I think the cornerstone is it has to be meaningful, not just offered, and that goes back to understanding what the needs of the community are. Early voting must be accessible. It must be in places that the community can get to. It means understanding where people live and what their transportation options are and are not, and that the voting system itself is accessible. Everything that's supposed to happen on election day in terms of legal requirements also should apply if it's early voting as well. So it's one thing to talk to each other. It's only as good as effectiveness and meaning. So.
And community-based organizations do have the right to register voters. So if you want to touch bases with me, I can maybe find out a little bit more about what you're encountering.
And I have just one quick comment about this very question, which is, it's correct what Gail said. Some counties allow weekend voting, but not all counties offer it. And this is a great example of how we have varied procedures from county to county that make it very difficult for groups to send out a message such as ours statewide to all voters to say, guess what, you can go in your county election office and vote this weekend, because the legislature passed laws to permit counties to do this, but they didn't mandate it because they don't want to pay any money for it. So if we want to have it in every county, we have to have the legislature make it a mandate and help supplement the costs.
And I'll finally add, and certainly there are constraints based on the fact that California is very careful about the integrity and the security of our voting systems, and that is something I hope will be addressed and that there will be fixes found, but that may be a very long-term kind of fix. Maybe one more question. I don't know if there's still a person back there. Two, because I've been looking over that way all the time. How about this question, and then one from over here?
Hi, my name's Keith Miller. I'm with the San Mateo County Elections Office. I would like to thank all the panel for your comments. The main takeaway I got from the panel is that your primary motivation is to figure out ways to maximize turnout, to make it so that not just more citizens are registered, more citizens vote. We want a higher percentage of voters. And there's a lot of practical ideas that have been put forward, especially the automated voted requests, which I think automated registration, which is a great idea and is necessary. My question, though, is we also, I think, should consider ideas that aren't on the immediate horizon of groups, but long-term show success at raising turnout. And what I'd like to ask the group is, many countries, such as Australia, have a policy of mandatory voting, where there's a nominal tax if you don't vote. Now, there are constitutionality questions that haven't been addressed by the courts, but my question for the panel is this. If the registration process was made dramatically easier or even dissolved altogether such that anyone could vote on election day, provided they were of age, would you be willing to consider a mandatory voting process such as a nominal tax like they do in Australia, which has been shown to dramatically increase voter turnout?
No. A big no.
You know what? I think I'm going to ask
But I
at
think the
least,
same-day registration, has been passed, and I think that's going to give a tool for people who didn't get registered on time once we get the statewide voter registration database.
I
Yeah,
see the
just
other end of...
Two
okay.
things. One is, no matter how small the tax is, it's going to have a regressive effect on low-income people and people who are poor. Two, look, it's not just a matter of changing policies to get people to turn out. So you not only have to have an accessible system, but there's a whole nother set of work that's being done by many of the folks in this room about engaging people and getting people turned on to participation. And, we have a very simple formula for our nonprofit work, which is information plus invitation equals participation. A lot of us will continue to engage folks by sending messages about how to vote, but also educating people about the importance of voting and the connection between voting and making changes in your life. And until people feel, in addition to having accessible voting, but until people feel that, this is relevant to my life, this is going to make a change, imposing a tax or imposing a penalty is really, really not the way to go.
Thank you. I would like to come over to this side of the room and acknowledge another question.
Yes. My name is Joanna Cuevas Ingram. I'm an Equal Justice Works Voting Rights Fellow at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and I do work with Robert Rubin and many others in this room on voting rights issues. My question is about the impact of realignment, especially as we move to online statewide voter registration. Some of you may be familiar that the League of Women Voters, as well as the ACLU and other groups with the Lawyers Committee, did bring a petition for writ of mandate last year in 2011 after realignment, asking about the status of Californians with felony convictions and the potential disenfranchisement of over 85,000 Californians, many of whom identify as African American and Latino, who have contact with the criminal justice system. My question is about the definition of prison and parole under our current law, which if a person in California is in state prison or on parole under a 2006 court case in California McPherson, they are not eligible to vote. However, these new statuses and categories of sentencing under realignment do not specifically state that the person will be in prison or on parole, so these folks are returning to their communities, attempting to rehabilitate, and are barred from voting under a memo that was issued in December 2011 by the Secretary of State. We are concerned about this expansion of potential disenfranchisement to this population and are wondering what might be the possibilities for enfranchisement of this population, as well as perhaps eliminating constitutionally the limitation on the rights of Californians with a felony conviction who are in state prison or on parole from voting. So expanding the right to vote to those who are on parole. And this is
Thank
for
you.
the whole
And-
panel.
And as exercising the right of the moderator, I will speak for the League of Women Voters. We were very surprised that court case was decided as quickly as it was and almost peremptorily. So I would certainly welcome everyone in the room thinking about this issue, and it certainly brings up the question of what's needed. Legislation, work with the Secretary of State or the county elections officials, work by nonprofits, and I don't know for sure, but I would assume that it may be a legislative fix that is needed. We certainly did not believe that in the process of realignment, where there was this new category of persons who had been convicted of a crime, but who were treated very differently from those who were sent to prison or were on parole from prison. I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to add a comment or two, but I think this is something that folks should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's also a really great example of how if various stakeholders come together, they'll understand there's a practical solution here. After realignment, you had this new category of people that the Secretary of State's office issued the memo saying they weren't eligible to vote. Those people are not in prison. They're not on parole. They are now being sentenced to county jail or a certain status of post-release supervision. And there are various categories of that. So the memo was issued before realignment had actually been implemented. And it's confusing. Most people don't know what their status is. And I can tell you because the ACLU made 150 phone calls in the 3 weeks before the election, and asked all the registrars in the state, can I vote if I'm on probation? I'm on post-release community supervision. Can I vote? We listed the categories, and no one knew. The law wasn't implemented. The courts weren't instructed as to how the information that needed to be sent. So in addition to the de facto disenfranchisement, because of the confusion now that you have some people in jail who can vote and some people who can't, you've got some people who are supervised by probation who can vote and others supervised by probation who can't. So it brings to mind, okay, one is how would you implement such a thing? It requires a legislative fix, I think, now to fix it. But it also brings up the question as we think about realignment, right? Realignment meaning we're thinking about the way in which we reintegrate people into their community, and that someone who is going back into the community and now being supervised locally, that the idea is to reduce recidivism, that person should be able to vote and participate in their democracy and be civically engaged in their community, and that doing that reduces recidivism. So that it brings up the larger question in the state of California that hopefully we look at the long term is, why are we excluding these people from the franchise, particularly when it has such a disproportionate impact on communities of color?
Thank you. I think there may be some grumbling stomachs, and so I'm going to say that we must call this to a halt. Thank you for your patience in letting us go past the noon hour. We will certainly appreciate the chance to bring all this up to folks, and I, like many others, want to say that we appreciate so much the work of the James Irvine Foundation in supporting both this conference and the whole examination and working together in collaboration on all these important issues. Thank you.